Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're joined by Dr. Peyman Vahabzadeh, sociologist, theorist of radical phenomenology, and author of For Land and Culture. Born and raised in Iran, Peyman participated in the 1979 revolution at just 17 years old. His work excavates one of the most overlooked experiments of the Turkmen Shuras, grassroots councils that organize land redistribution, women's literacy, participatory democracy, community defense in the revolutionary vacuum. This is a really important conversation. We loved talking about this book, and obviously, with everything happening now with Iran, Lebanon, the US, Israel, and a number of other countries and political configurations, it's a very important conversation that I think will help center a lot of people around the politics of the past, how those politics relate to today. We talk quite a bit about political violence. We talk about different forms of violence. We talk about the role of women in various movements. And it's just a very far reaching conversation that I think will be important. And obviously, right now, keep the people on the ground and across the diaspora in these various contexts in your mind, because there's a lot happening right now. And I think we deserve to listen to people that care about the quality of all. So I hope this is an enlightening conversation. And without further ado, let's get into the interview.
The first question we love to ask people is, what is a young you like? Or what was a young Peyman like?
The young Peyman in his teens gradually became a revolutionary by the time he was kind of, young, if you like, 17, 18. At the age of 17, I participated in the revolution of 1979. And, one of the rare, dying generation that actually has participated in a revolution. And I don't want to bore you with the details, but one thing that participating in a revolution shows you is the true sense of freedom. For the moment when the old regime is gone, the state's choking grip on your soul is lifted, and there is not yet another state to maintain that old order. It's a true sense of freedom. So I learn and I hear from people speaking about freedom as if it's a state of being, but without ever having experienced that state of being. That's a little curious to me, but also fascinating, because this sense of freedom is actually what drives us, a lot of us, not all of us, but to become, to use imagination, to become visionaries. So, and then in the next few years after the revolution, I was part of the left and tried to sort of challenge the rising, Islamists and so on and so forth. It wasn't a very happy story. It was very dangerous times. Anyways, that ended up in all activists and all political tendencies outside of the ruling elite, basically, or the rising ruling elite, being crushed by the force of the state, by some kind of a demonic violence, if you like. And then I left. I had no choice but leaving, and the rest is history.
Have you ever come close to feeling that free again?
Never. I came to Canada, and as a refugee. I came here as a refugee. I was, when I left Iran, I became a refugee in Turkey. So I lived in Turkey for a while, and when I was sent here by the UNHCR as a conventional refugee, the whole discourse was that, oh, you have come to the land of freedom, and so on and so forth. And I realized that there is a hegemonic construct, if you like, called freedom. And this freedom is the freedom of choice between, I don't know, Whole Foods and Walmart, or freedom of choice between Netflix and HBO, and the freedom of choice between going to Caribbean or Africa for your vacation. The freedom of choice between, this company or that company as my career. So it was really a sort of very regulated life that I experienced here. Not that I don't appreciate those choices, I do, but it really was a sort of a rhetorical deployment of the idea so that people stay in their place. For somebody who has seen an entire political regime to collapse, the fifth largest army in the world, it was said at that time in 1979, the Imperial Army of Iran, that to collapse, and then that sense of all the pressure of all the sort of normative rule being lifted, nothing really measures up to that. So ever since, as a kind of old revolutionary and as a romantic, you might say, I always wanted to experience that freedom again. So when I see people like in the Zapatistas or in Rojava, or places like that, when people rise up, actually start self-governing, I see that freedom being enacted, or people taking measures, to make that freedom happen. But anyways, I understand that's not a very common experience. So in a way, I think we are driven by freedom. And because we are driven, humans are capable of collectively self-govern, and therefore driven by freedom in that sense. It is important for powers that be to hegemonize that idea, to propagate that idea with some kind of a very measurable substance, such as choice, such as going to the ballot box and choosing between this millionaire or that millionaire, right? Or this person supported by such and such, companies, and that person, like it's become a little, tedious. There's never really a choice, Yeah, and unlike self-governance, these people are being salaried. Like salaried politician, we have learned like 100 years ago, actually, in the work of Max Weber, that the salaried politician is always a conflicted politician. Do they have political allegiances to the ideas, or are they driven by money? And increasingly, we see in our world today that people are driven by money.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could talk about what that felt like or looked like for you as you were coming of age and that feeling that freedom in that revolution, and then having the circumstance or decision, or mainly I feel like circumstance, to have to leave, and what that was like for you. And you said you went to Turkey first, and then what else was your journey like?
Yeah, that's another story on its own, because at the time, and still, I think still today, and still everywhere today, I must say, a refugee is a non-existing human. Every state denies refugees. They don't like refugees. No state, in fact, no modern state likes people on the move, right? People have to be sedentary, people have to be located, people have to be in a physical vicinity where they can be traced. Nobody likes people who move. Nobody likes the people who move without authorization. And refugees are just like that, right? So Turkey wasn't very, the state of Turkey, the people were fantastic. I really, spread roots in Turkey, and I still love the country. But the state still denied us. So the whole process of being a refugee in Turkey was, at the time, I'm talking about late 1980s, And there was a coup d'etat. Don't forget that, I think 1982. So there was like military had and police had a lot of power, a lot of power. So it was like living semi-underground. So you basically show up when you have to show up. I got arrested by the police a couple of times. Just, it was a harassment arrest, really. Like they check your documents and so on. And they keep you in their headquarters for the day, without food or, well, water. You can have water, but without food. And, then they release you on conditions. The conditions are ridiculous. Um, so, um, so from that, now I'm connecting your questions together, right? From that sense of freedom to becoming an entirely rightless human. Because although I was recognized as a conventional refugee by the UNHCR, the UN had no power, to protect us, So it was a unique experience. By the way, having said all this, I'm glad I had that experience because you really have to see all aspects of political life in order to come up with an idea, and not be followers of dominant ideas, but kind of, what I've been trying to do in my life, ever since that, carve out ideas, out of the people's experiences, the way they saw how they could be free, the way they thought how to be free, and so on. So this has been my, intellectual, if you like, concern ever since. How can we create spaces for thinking, for acting, for not submitting, basically, and living free? To live free is very important, I think. In my first book, I called it transgressive actor. Even if you cannot live free because conditions don't allow you, you can always transgress. And transgression becomes a form of life. Whether this is a transgression in fixed gender, boundaries, whether it's a transgression in the way you behave in society, whether it's a transgression, in my case, the way I teach my courses. You have to transgress, and that's probably the first step towards freedom or experiencing freedom, because you may not challenge the rules, if you like, but you disregard them. And that's a good thing, that's healthy, if you like, for your psyche, for your soul, right? Yeah. Do I have a authority issue? I think I do.
I think it's healthy.
Yeah, and I guess this is a question connected to what you just said, but are there particular moments of transgression that you felt during like that time period, especially around 1979 and afterwards or over time? Because I think I'm really invested in how can we name these very simple processes that are also really complex and how they radicalize us, affect us, compel us to act. So yeah, I'm curious about that.
Very good. Yeah, so the entire process of participating in a revolution that was nonviolent, I must say this, it was nonviolent revolution, but the permanent victory of the revolution came through 2 days of popular armed uprising. There's no doubt about it. So in other words, while for months there was this pressure built, through nonviolent rallying, protesting, strikes, whatever. The final blow came through armed uprising. There's no doubt about that. And mind you, this has been, historically recorded that at the time before the uprising took place, and the uprising was a if I might say, accidental, uh, craft of the leftist guerrillas and a specific section of the Air Force. And there was a mutiny in one Air Force base, and the guerrillas, helped them, and they all attacked the army and so on and so forth, and that spread. In order for you to survive in such conditions, what you have to do is to arm people, and then they armed people, and then what have you. It just took 2 days to bring down the fifth largest army in the world. 2 days. Anyways, but we do know that at that time the clerics that were leading the revolution were actually negotiating with the Americans for a peaceful transition of power. So just this is a fantastic case of people's power imposing itself upon the decisions or the visions of the rulers or potential rulers or the people trying to come into power. So in by the simplest form of transgression, we didn't go to school. Very, very simple. I was a high school student. No school. We go to the rally, right? Confronting the police, confronting the army, and so on. All of these, and you're risking your life. Let's not forget that I don't know, thousands of people were killed, in the several months process of protesting and rallying and so on. So that's the one. But also, I want to say this since you asked the question. I was also transgressive in terms of, because I joined the left, and I was kind of, I was always in favor of egalitarianism and social justice. And for that, I have to thank my family, because they raised me with that sense of justice. The major, soul purifying transgression was my ideological rebellion against my own ideology, right? So I was never religious in my ideology, and so on and so forth. And by ideology, I mean Marxism, right? So I always questioned it. I always put its truisms to the test of practical politics and so on. So I still think I do transgress, but yeah, it all depends on the context, right? And on context is very important, and on the potentials of a people, right? So you live in the United States. It's an amazing society, because you have the most conformist people, you have the most right-wing people, and then you have the most revolutionary and creative people, right? Just all over the place. It's an amazing place, right? And with a lot of, with a lot of great traditions of challenging, power and so on and so forth. Now, how those traditions play themselves out in contemporary society, that's another thing, right? But yeah. So I do remember, by the way, when I was young, reading about, the Black Panthers, for example, reading about, we read the poetry, translated though, of Langston Hughes. Like all Iranians loved it, like literary oriented Iranians love Langston Hughes, right? Just amazing poetry, right? And of course, how can you translate that into Persian? Like the Persian had a life of its own, right? So, like that was a Persian Langston Hughes, right? And so on. So it's just, all these influences that you take from the world that make you think, oh, the world is not this little box in which, I'm being thrown, and then there's expectation that I should live my life this way or that way, because it pleases other people, but it also pleases those who wish to, extract labor from me, in whatever capacity, whether I'm worker or engineer, really makes no difference. There's somebody who wishes to, take something out of my labor. So that's also, not to, while you have to survive economically, not to let that happen in its entirety. Like, in a way, we have to do a little bit of, a little bit of help in, not letting the machine work smoothly, right? That's the least we can do. The least, whatever comes after that is a decision of the collective. It's not really an individual thing, but individuals can prepare for that.
Yeah, Prince has been doing a lot of videos kind of using the language of James C. Scott on anarchist calisthenics and talking about that as kind of, it reminds you of like your transgressive actors framework as well.
Yeah, like Baldwin. You have an example of Baldwin, right? Yes, absolutely. Like it's total transgression,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reading a lot of him now and writing about him, and especially like connecting these different threads. I think about the importance of like what you're speaking to, like personal transgression, like challenging one's own ideas and like doing things that challenge a sense of self, but also being indebted to a collective struggle, and how, I don't know, like both need to exist in order for like us and the people we're around to continually change. And I feel like moments of revolutionary struggle bring that experiment forward even more, or it presents like a particular opportunity, is how I kind of think of it. But I love Baldwin.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always think it's a shame when he doesn't get talked about as the great anti-authoritarian he is. I'm like, he is just fully through everything, and he didn't have to leave an institution to question it. And then when he did decide to leave one, he still had or was within the like cosmology of it and like held true to that. And I was like, that was something that was always very interesting to me about Baldwin.
What Baldwin books do you like? I have to know.
I'm not sure. I've read Baldwin in sections and extracts, mostly a lot of times in Persian, but recently only in English.
Okay.
Because I'm trying to use that tradition in my courses, right? So I haven't read really like any of his books.
Okay.
But I was introduced to Baldwin very young, at a very young age, And I must say that all of these thanks to my father. My father was American educated. He went to Columbia and then came back to Iran. So he brought a lot of American history with him. From jazz music to all sorts of things. He really showed me a lot of history of resistance, if you like. In America, right? And the whole history of America being the history of slavery, really. And now they're the founders of America and so on. They try to cover it up, right? And still to this day, right? But how that culture kind of permeates, the real life of America every day, that history permeates,
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that, because this is maybe not totally related, but I think with everything that's been happening in the US, like politically, makes me think a lot about like the lessons of survival my parents gave me being Black in America, and how a lot of those lessons of survival are antithetical to the things that I'm trying to cultivate in my life now. Like as a radical, as a revolutionary, like if you're stopped by the cop, you do whatever you need to make it home. But then like what does that chip away in the process, which is something I think like Baldwin talks a lot about too. But I'm super curious about like what the process of going through the revolution was for like you and your family, because I don't know, I feel like you being 17, I'm just super curious how you and your family navigated things, or
Well,
what that was
let
like.
me tell you. So our mom was always against us going to the streets because she's a mom. She has to protect us, And our dad always said, yeah, well, he actually came with us, and it wasn't easy for him to rally because he had, prior to the revolution, he had two accidents where he broke a lot. He broke his pelvis, he broke his foot. So walking for him wasn't very easy. But he always used the canes ever since, for the next 40 years in his life. And so he would come with us, actually, But we always said, you can't protect us, really, like we can run, you cannot run, you'll be shot, So that's the kind of personal part of it. But when these things happen, when there was this collective sense of dissent in society, somehow we all felt that we should join this because we all saw the way the country, unlike the picture that is being portrayed nowadays, because the clerics in Iran have done so much damage to the country that the previous time looks great, because you compare like the monarchy with a period in which there's absolutely nothing you can say about this, nothing positive you can say about this regime, except that they created a very sophisticated military a hardware system, with their missiles and drones and so on. They excel.
Iranians are always really good at that, right? The only thing people can ever say is they made a great military.
Oh yeah, the states are great in that, and everything else, like in one of the richest countries in the world nowadays, because of the disastrous policies of this state, the Islamic Republic, and because of the United States sanctions. About 90% of the population is now at or under poverty line. So imagine that. So compared to this, yeah, the older time was, wow, that was heaven, and that's the picture we get nowadays, especially in Iranian diaspora and so on and so forth. However, we were, I was born in a working class neighborhood, and we lived in until I was 18, we lived in working class neighborhoods, and then we moved on to a kind of middle class neighborhood. Our parents got better salaries and so on and so forth, so we could do a little better. And that living in working class neighborhoods, and living with working class boys, and children, and playing with them and going to school with them, that showed me how social inequalities permanently damage people's futures. And that, I say this now, towards the end of my life, but that back then I kind of sensed it. I couldn't formulate it, I couldn't theorize it, I couldn't conceptualize, but there was a sense that this boy who sits right next to me in the class, his father has addiction, therefore he's not going anywhere in his life. If his life doesn't get worse, it probably won't get better. So those things you see, and then you see, a lot of abuses, and you see a lot of poverty, and you see a lot of people, like, in school you're eating your sandwich, and a kid is just keeps staring at you because they don't have a sandwich or they don't have a food, with them at school and so on. And these things, gradually these things permeate your thinking, right? I tell you one more thing that really decisively made me a revolutionary. I was 13 years old. And, we went to the middle school, and there was this Armenian kid who was probably 1 year older than me. And apparently, one day in the class, he said something about the Shah. I don't know if he insulted him or whatever, or where he learned it from, I don't know. But he said something from the Shah. And then the next day, they brought him out to the schoolyard, and they, make the rest of the school line up and so on. And they brought him to the front. It was a sort of, teaching moment, if you like. It's dramatic and it's tragic, but it was a teaching moment for him. And the school vice principal beat him up so badly that they had to drag his body out. And the vice principal repeatedly said, "You insulted the Shah, and this is what you get." That moment, I realized how oppressed we were. And, that was for me, talking about my life, that was the moment when I became revolutionary. From that moment on, I did not believe anything. And that's age of 13. I did not believe in anything anybody said about this regime, about, the whole country and so on and so forth. Right? If you cannot speak one word about, whoever, and get punished that badly. I think later on they called his parents and just they came and picked him up. But the viciousness of that violence against a 13, 14-year-old, that was the moment I woke up to the reality of my life.
Makes me think of the moments that we have when we're younger, where maybe on some level, when I've experienced not that exact thing, but moments when I was younger and someone was in trouble, or I don't know, something wrong was happening. And I always thought, oh, when I'm older, I want to be someone who can do something, or someone that can try to do something. And I think, yeah, I feel like I kind of sense that in kind of what you're saying. And it seems like, and you did.
Yeah, I guess from this point, I guess I'm curious what drove you. You mentioned what kind of drove you into your focus in academia, but what drove you to this book specifically?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jordan. Yes, youthfulness. So the revolution happens. I'm 17 years old, and this movement unfolds far away from me. But somehow the news reaches me. Why? Because I have a very dear classmate that I hang out with. There were the three of us basically in the last year of high school, and he was a Turkmen, right? And he always went back and forth, and he told us a lot of stories. And then I got really interested in the Turkmen movement. For the duration of the movement, I was really a supporter, but how much can you support from afar? But kind of moral supporter. I went to their events, I purchased because one of the ways in which the movement raised funds was to record the long suppressed Turkmen music. They recorded, on cassette tapes, and they would sell it across the country. So I would buy those, and buy it, gift it to friends, and so on. So from that moment onwards, I knew, and I was very young. I really didn't know much, but I was kind of, again, emotionally impressed, if you like, or emotionally attached to this movement. So I saw a people who made up, at least at that point, about 1% of the country's population. No, 2% of the country's population, 1% of the country's area, total area. Such a marginalized people, right? Living far from us, right? But they try to do something great out of this very unique historical moment that's the revolution. So the revolution happens, they say, oh, we can create something new, and they created something new. That's what basically made me research this movement. It was in the back of my head for many years. And then one day we were talking with friends about this movement and how, how the way we were supporting it. And somebody said, Peyman, you need to write that book. Don't procrastinate anymore. Write that book. That was, I think, 2020. And I wrote the book.
And I really love, I think you mentioned it before, how you were always questioning like the dogmatism of certain Marxisms and how you reapply and explain what sort of like European Marxist foundations you're breaking down and how they should be reapplied or understood through the Iranian sense. I guess, how or what do you feel like grounds that point of view? Because to me, that's extremely Marxist of like being able to actually like take frameworks and put it into like your local context. I feel like that's what makes the best Marxist. Okay, what drove you there?
Mhm. As the fundamental critique of capitalism, I think Marxism still to this day has a lot to teach us. In practical application of Marxism, this is where all the divergence and all the criticisms comes in, and for good reasons, and quite appropriately, I must say. So I'm not really defending any kind of, any iteration of Marxist, theory. Note that, for example, Marxism is completely malleable, completely flexible, right? It's if you take the basic idea, the rest of it can be worked out according to your context, which is, as you said, it is a really Marxist idea, that in itself. So, I, in my classes, I say, when the context comes up, I say, oh, Marx said that, workers have to, organize and rise up and overthrow capitalism. And then what happened in Russia, because Russia did not have a working class, really like 3% of the Russian population in the early 20th century were working class, 3-4%, something like that, a very small minority. So the Russian Social Democratic Party or the Bolshevik Party basically created the vanguard party, right? So they created a party of dedicated salaried intellectuals and party cadres, and basically they staged the revolution. The Russian Revolution wasn't a really revolution; it was a coup d'état, as you all know. The Bolshevik units of the army and navy stormed the Winter Palace and took over the government, and that's it. And now you have a revolution. So, in the classical sense of French Revolution, this wasn't a revolution, really. So then Mao Zedong comes along, and well, China doesn't have strong working class either, and it's very hard to organize them, but has a very large population of peasants. So he creates peasant army, and then that's another revolution. And then the Cubans come along, and they have neither of those. They're just a bunch of very zealous, very dedicated intellectuals, and they go to the, what's that? Well, they go to the shore, Bay of Pigs, and they get mowed down by the police who had infiltrated there, and 12 of them survive, including Castro, Raúl Castro, Fidel Castro, and Che Guevara. And the 12 of them in 2 years, with the help of course, labor unions in the city, overthrow the Batista regime, right? So look, all of these three revolutions in the 20th century, three, kind of great revolutions, if you like, are being done in the name of Marxism, but they each reinvented Marxism, really. So for me, Marxism is that reinvention, really. Like, take the principal critique of capitalism and see what you can do with it, right? Whether, like, I don't read them, but apparently there's a lot of criticism between these, Maoists and Marxist-Leninists and Castrists and this and that, like, yeah, you're not doing it right, we are doing it right. And somehow the right application of Marxism, or any revolutionary idea for that matter, I'm not singling out Marxism, depends on the success of its application. So when I was writing the Turkmen book, I wasn't really interested in what, like in their heads, when they're reading books, what they think about Marxism, but in the practical application of the idea of social justice of a large number of peasants from a specific ethnicity and a specific language and a specific religion, right, that have been deprived and dispossessed of their own ancestral lands. So instead of reading a lot of Marxism into this, I read their own literature. And their literature starts with, we, the Turkmens, have been dispossessed of their ancestral land. That's the term they use, abo ajdadi, ancestral, right? Because we have been here for 1,000 years and we have kept this place, as a form of life. It's our life. We use it as a pasture, we use it as a farm, We used it to trade, in the 19th century, trade mostly with the Russians, and so on. So this is, for me, this is practical revolutionary theory, if you like. So praxis, that the sense of praxis is very important for me. And if you look at it, throughout the world, not every, but a lot of autonomous movements that we witness today, from the Zapatistas to Rojava, to the Spanish village of Marinaleda in southern Spain, they all come up with the same idea, if you like, that people collectively can govern themselves and do not need anyone to boss them, and they do not have to engage in capitalist relations. Although, trading with anybody outside of your community, you engage with the capitalist relations. It's inevitable. But I don't really have to submit to that internally. So basically, they all take that idea, each in its own way, So, for instance, the Turkmen lands were privatized by early 20th century, but they never really had this notion of private ownership of land. It's very similar to indigenous ideas, that land is not for, sale. Land cannot be possessed, cannot be owned, right? Same idea, land belongs to the tribe, but this belonging is not legal, right? And tribes negotiate with one another over, who can use what piece of land for what purpose, and that's the way they have been living for 1,000 years. I'm not trying to, glamorize this, but it's been sustainable. And in fact, if you look at my book, in one of the epigraphs to one of the chapters, in a passage, I took a historic document written in 19th century of the governor who was assigned to the Turkmen region, and is describing the Turkmen region. And he says that the grass, grows so long that the Turkmens use it to fatten their horses. Like, it's just such a ecologically sound, yes, pre-industrial, but ecologically sound, sustainable, way of life. And then industrialization and land ownership, laws of land ownership come. So I look at this and say, oh, gee, isn't it exactly how the United States was created? How Canada was created? They created these, artificial things called treaties, and they dispossessed the indigenous people of their ancestral lands, that they had been using for thousands of years, right, in a very sustainable manner, and then, force them into reservations, and then sell the rest of the land. So in a way, American industrialization was really subsidized by indigenous land, right? Without which America could not have competed with Europe.
Yeah, and if it didn't have such that upstart capital of free labor, farmed free labor, it would have, like, it being a superpower where it is, and then immediately becoming a colonial naval power would not have been as possible.
Absolutely. And they did that, of course, in great part, due to indigenous land dispossession, but also to slavery, transatlantic slavery, right? Which, if you look at in a kind of miniature way, what happened to the Turkmens, because they were dispossessed of their land, now they have to use as extremely cheap labor. Like, it's not slave conditions, but like their wages were so low. And
it reminds me of like the internal colony theory stuff of like of being ghettoed, of like being ghettoed by the state on purpose. And I was bringing this up to someone recently. I can't remember, and I guess they didn't really appreciate the framing of it as much, it being in the same way as Iran, because is what we were talking about. But to me, it very much does feel like internal colonialism, and in the powers or centers of power an empire trying to solidify its grasp within the borders that it has, especially as all the borders around it are hardening.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, by the way, you bring us the question of borders. Why do we have borders? Precisely because we want to control land and the labor that goes on land. Like I said, states hate people on the move. That's why they hate nomads. That's why they, force like the Comanches and so on into sedentary reservation. They cannot roam across this vast land and so on. You cannot do it. I cannot manage you if you do that, right? So yeah, they love their borders because it's all about control of population and control of the resources in the land. You cannot have like the previous age, pre 19th, 18th, 19th century, where there was empires and the land wasn't really like, there was no borders, people would move around and so on and so forth. It was really more about allegiance of this tribe to the prince, or that tribe to the prince, or then this tribe says, oh, I'm fed up with this prince. I make allegiances to the other prince, So, like in the case of Eastern Europe, they, shift alliances between, Austro-Hungarian Empire or Ottoman Empire, or, they could change, their political allegiances. But nowadays we have these fixed borders precisely because the state, which is a political embodiment of capitalism, I must say that, needs to control, labor needs to control land and its resources, of course, which is a scary thought if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all that level of organizing under such violence can be extremely, I think it's extremely terrifying. It's just kind of the precipice of what we have right now. I kind of was wondering, the Turkmen Shuras, or the councils, are like at the heart of your study. Can you paint a picture for our listeners on how these councils functioned on a daily basis? How were decisions made, managed land, organized defenses?
Yeah, lovely. So this is where I realize how culture is important in the vision for the vision of future, right? And the way the Turkmens have been governing themselves, the Turkmens never had tribal chiefs. Just like, and I found a lot of similarities to many indigenous cultures when I was studying the Turkmen movement. So the Turkmens basically ruled themselves through elderly councils of each village or each tribe, because some Turkmens are sedentary, they have villages, some are nomadic, they're pastoral, they basically raise cattle, or sheep, I must say, sheep and goats. So they don't have specific land. They have just this stretch of land where they herd their sheep and so on and so forth. They never have chieftains. They never have authority. So they have been governing themselves through village or tribal councils. These are elderly villages called Yashuli, and elderly councils called Yashuli. And the way they worked was basically, it's a patriarchal society, so older men with a lot of experience. And note that elderly here have a specific status because their life expectancy is not that much like modern humans. It's just, your basically life expectancy is 30, 40, right? So when you get into your 60s, you're an elder, right? Because you have seen 6 decades or 7 decades of what happened to the land and how previous generations dealt with it. So it's accumulated knowledge. Okay, so when the first village spontaneously took over, occupied its own ancestral land, that was the village of Marjanabad. And it is said, it's a little vague here, and I couldn't really pinpoint it. It is said that they did it 2 or 3 days, or even a week before the revolution. But some people say, some other accounts say 1 week after the revolution. They saw that the older, not the older, sorry, the former landowners have fled because they had association with the top of monarchy. and therefore it's their land. They went in and took over. Uh, so that was a first land occupation. And they said, how do we govern that? Oh, let's go back to our tradition, which is, put together the elders council, okay, or Shura, the elders council. So they did that, but within a few weeks, when the movement really took off, before that. So this happens, and then all the neighboring tribes and villages say, oh, why don't we do that? So they start doing that. 3 months or 4 months into the revolution, you have I have a figure of about 300 councils, village councils, and other councils, fishermen council, women councils, teachers councils. Everybody creates councils. So it spreads like, the morning dew. It just covers the whole area. Self-governance from below. It's entirely grassroots, right? So nobody really no intellectual from the town told them how to do. But within a few weeks, when everybody started spreading, this idea, what happened was that a lot of young people, a lot of them being high school students, so it's very important, but also university educated people, said that, oh, that's a great model, but it's undemocratic. So what happened was, if I belong to this village, and I'm a high school student or graduate or university graduate or whatever, and I've read a few books and I know a few things, about how, government works, how society works, and so on and so forth. So they went back to their ancestral or their parental villages, and they created democratic councils. Now, these councils are democratically elected in the sense that, some of them are, elderly men because they have the experience, but then young people also join in. And they actually welcome young people because these are educated people. They can read, not only read and write, but they're familiar with the whole setup of the country, how things work, and bureaucratic administration, and so on and so forth. So young people became very instrumental in democratizing the councils. The councils then, so again, I emphasize, this is grassroots. Nobody told them what to do. But then within a month after the revolution, when there were so many councils, the sort of leading intellectuals of the movement, who were mostly kind of cultural figures, really, they were not really political figures. Mostly they were cultural figures. The engineer behind that was a lawyer, right? Hakim Makhtoum, as I said in my book. They said, oh, this needs to be organized. And so they created the central headquarters of the councils of the people of Turkmen. And so they began to coordinate, but also they began to educate people on how to do their agriculture, how to do their economics, how to, address the issues of the village, and so on and so forth, but also how to deal with the returning landowners, the emerging militias of the regime, who are actually siding with landowners, because for them ownership is a sacred thing. You cannot violate them, and how to deal with them in a non-violent fashion, because you don't want to be confronting, armed people, as an unarmed, peasants. So this is basically how the Shuras came along. For 1 year, we saw a fantastic way of people governing themselves. The central headquarters helped them enormously, coordinated them, and created this very sophisticated system in which a number of village councils unified in regional union, and then the regional union sent representatives to their high council, if you like. If you look at that model, and that's 1979, if you look at that model and kind of compare it to something that came later in Rojava, right? Rojava revolution started in 2012. Okay, so they created a 4-tier model of their councils, regional councils, federal council, and the high council, right? The great thing about the Rojava model was that the lower council or the lower self-administration is not bound by the decision of the higher self-administration. That's the most democratic way of doing things, right? In other words, if you're higher council and you say, I don't know, we need roads between this and that, but the villages or the towns that are, in that vicinity say, no, we don't need roads because then, we don't have the funds, or we don't have the manpower, or we cannot, provide security for that. Then you just say, well, we cannot do that, right? And of course, with your reason. So in the Turkmen experience, I saw that kind of model of governance as having its roots in grassroots councils, as a fantastic model of self-governance, and self-rule and autonomy. That's very important for me. Like I said, did I say this? I don't know. Like, state is an artificial creation of the Europeans in the medieval times. They created states because they were killing each other in Europe in the 30 Years' War, right? Christians, yes. Catholics and Protestants were killing each other. So they came up with this Westphalian idea of Westphalian treaty, in fact, of sovereignty of states, signed 1648, if I'm not mistaken. So the entire model of nation state was forged because there was a civil war within Europe. And then when Europe colonized other societies, they sort of exported this model, to other places and created artificial countries, like as in, Latin America, for example. All of these countries are artificial. Middle East, all the countries are artificially created, right? Lebanon, Israel, Syria, all artificial. Iraq, Kuwait, all artificially created, because they should serve the interests of imperialists, and because there's oil there and so on, or there is resources in Latin America and so on and so forth, right? So as an alternative to the state, I see this, autonomous movements. They are small, but like everything else starts from small. We started from small.
Yeah.
Everyone starts from small and then grows into the appropriate size, so to speak. And we are hoping that this will be the future of humanity.
You talked about how there were a lot of different councils that came up, and there were women's councils. I'm curious, what was the role of women in the council movement? You mentioned if that was part of the democratizing against some of the built-in patriarchy, but also understanding how often racist state protection of women as a pretext for control. So I'm curious how the Shuras offered some of a different social framework for gender relations.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one of the greatest challenges of the entire movement was to uplift the status of women, right? And yes, the whole idea of empowering women can be a very patriarchal idea. It could be controlled by other means, and so on. So I understand that entirely. The way they try to do this and uplift women's status required a grassroots movement. So in order to do that, they needed to educate the Turkmen society. So two things I must say as the context here. One is that traditionally Turkmen women, although it's a patriarchal society, had a lot of economic contribution to the household and to the village. They not only participated in agriculture or sheep herding and so on and so forth. Not only did they weave rugs, the Turkmen rugs have a very specific motif, and they're completely identifiable anywhere. And they were very popular, especially in the Caucasus areas, in Russia and so on and so forth. So they basically had women had the opportunity to create wealth for the household. But traditionally, if you look at some very old pictures of the Turkmen women, you can see that they're, in their traditional garment, but these garments are decorated with gold. So they were basically the bankers of the household and of the tribe. They held a lot of money basically in their traditional, all the savings in their traditional outfit. So in other words, they had an economic function. Women had an economic function in Turkmen society. That's different from like being entirely oppressed and so on and so forth. So that's one context. The other context is that so these people live in villages, and at the time there were only a few high schools. So there were a number of local elementary schools and a number of mobile schools at the time in the region. But high schools were few and far between. So a lot of young women, Turkmen women, who had gone through elementary school basically left their village and went to the town for high school. And this is where they socialize into these ideas, right? Because Turkmen region is predominantly Turkmen, but there's also Persians there, there's also Azerbaijani Turks in there. In more recent times, the Zabolis from south of Iran, who were also farmers, were brought in to do the labor, under the old ownership, land ownership. So they socialize into these ideas. So when the revolution happens and the councils spread, these young women, high school women, go back to their villages and start educating people. This includes not only their rights and how they should organize themselves, but simple things as literacy. So they started teaching women how to read and write. And that's how they created the Union of Rug Weavers or councils or something like that. And they also created the Union of Women. The fact that they could bring out Turkmen women to the rallies is a very significant achievement, right? But you're absolutely right in the sense that what did they actually achieve at the end? The answer is, well, the movement was defeated within 1 year. So therefore, to raise the status of women by the activists, including women, who participated in the movement, that's a long-term project. Okay. That said, I have heard and met with women of that generation who actually spoke about what they did. And a lot of their activism was really long-term shift, aimed at a long-term shift in changing the gender relations in Turkmen society. But like I said, I was told by a number of them that they basically had to flee the region, leave all these projects, behind because of their safety after the movement was defeated. But that's another topic, the way movement was defeated.
Yeah, I'm curious how you could talk about how the Shuras emerged and kind of dealt with like the classic dual power situation of like when the state collapsed and the new Islamic Republic was trying to do and come up. I really thought it was really interesting, like the uses of nonviolence being strategic about when to confront and how the new state was trying to use their marginalization against them, and eventually did, and got the left to be a part of crushing them. Or you can get into some of that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's that's a great question. So the grassroots council movement spreads fast in the region. And then the intellectuals who came back to the region start organizing them because they have been student activists elsewhere, throughout the country. They have some experience. So they start organizing them. Because Turkmens have this sense of national identity, have this sense of cultural identity, they trust their own leading bodies, whether it's the central headquarters of the councils or the, cultural, political, center or association of the Turkmens. They trust them more than they trust the government because the government is not Turkmen and it's not Sunni. That's also very important, right? So it's not just ethnic or cultural identity. Part of cultural identity is also religion. Okay, and a good number of Persians who live in the region are actually pro-Turkmen, right? Because one of the things that the Iranian left brought to Iranian political imagination, and that's very significant, was the notion that the states of Iran have been always repressive of national and cultural minorities. So they always were, one of the, aside from defending the rights of workers and peasants and so on, one of the things that Iranian left has invariably done was to defend the right of minorities in Iran. So a lot of Persians in the region also were pro-Turkmen movement. Where am I? So what happened was that this distrust in the emerging Shi'i clerical government and the absolute faith in their leaders, Turkmen leaders, and their Turkmen association created this duality. To the extent that, Turkmens did not really listen to the government. Simple as that. They did not listen to the government and government's rules and regulations. But they listened to everything that their leaders said. I give you an example. It's in the book. So it's the first harvest after the liberation, after the councils. It's in spring of 1979. I forgot, June probably, May, June. And they're harvesting wheat. And the government says, well, since these lands are occupied, and that's haram, right? That's illicit in Islamic tradition. So you have to submit all the harvest, all the crops to the state, to the government, but keep 20%. So that comes out as a regulation, right? It's announced that this harvest is going to be like this. What did the Turkmens did? What did they do? Nothing. They just harvested and kept it. So this is the extent of grassroots power. They didn't even challenge it. Of course, the leaders said, "Oh, we don't accept that," and so on. But in practice, they just kept the harvest, and they sold it, right? And that's it. That's what they did. So the dual power is this. Yes, the government had the governor's office. The government ran education. The government had militias in the region, and the road police and so on and so forth. But the practical affairs of the Turkmens was basically decided by the two governing bodies of the Turkmens. They really didn't listen to the government, and every time they had issues, they would just go, "Well, let's negotiate that," right? And negotiation is a great way of, non-violently kind of stopping your adversary. But the government at the same time used negotiation as a subterfuge in order to cover up its future plans to bring down the movement, which they did, a year into their councils. So nonviolence is very important because as a small minority, you cannot really militarily challenge the government. But at the same time, they had the means of self-defense. In other words, if the government's violence exceeds, beyond some measure, then we can defend ourselves. Other than that, we should not confront. Which, by the way, it reminds me of so many examples. For example, in Black Panthers, the whole idea of safety of the community. Not only safety, in confrontation with police, that's a great, motive there, if you like, but also safety against organized crime that is, ruining our communities and so on and so forth, right? So the whole idea of safety, but yes, we can defend ourselves, right? But we don't have to, we don't have to arm ourselves necessarily in order to do that, So, so it's a very delicate thing, right? It's a very delicate game to play. When your adversary has all the power, all the machinery, all the means of repression, and you basically have nothing, and you still want to survive, the situation. Anyways.
Yeah, I feel like that strategy reminds me. I just did a teach-in about the revolution and counter-revolution in Sudan, and it reminds me a lot of like all the deal making while the RSF and the SAF were all just gathering their forces and using it to just negotiate and get all the revolutionaries exhausted, divided, and tired, and till they could strike.
Like negotiating a 1-year plan versus a 10-year plan, and I'm like,
like none of you care. None of you care.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really interested in like how you're talking about and like unpacking nonviolence, because I guess I'm wondering how you apply positing about nonviolence in terms of a colonized group. Like maybe that's just a big question for like how do you apply that to like the world that we're living in today, or do you?
Wonderful question. I hope I can provide some insights here. So that was in my mind, the whole thing about violence and nonviolence. Again, where did that question come from? It came from the Iranian Revolution and my experience, because we went to the streets nonviolently, and at some point, I was shot at, and my brother and I, and so on. So you go against a violent force in a nonviolent way, but the way the revolution basically is won after this war of attrition, which is nonviolent, for several months, for at least 6 months. Then you have 2 days of armed uprising that brings down the regime. So this whole thing was in my mind for many years, and I was thinking, so and for these things to do anything about, you really need to read a lot of history, read a lot of movement experiences and so on. So many years ago, it came out in 2019. I wrote this book called Violence and Nonviolence: Conceptual Excursions into Phantom Opposites. It's a theoretical book, I'm not, trying to advertise that. So there, I basically came up with the idea that violence and nonviolence are not opposites. They are concentric. Violence is at the center of our civilization. All civilizations are based on violence. Nonviolence nonviolence represents two responses to violence. Number one is that it's an excess of violence. And for that, my example was the killing of African Americans by the police, in 2014, 2015, the four famous cases that came out, around that time, and the African American community rising up, which the media portrayed as riots. African Americans are rioting in Baltimore and so on and so forth, right? And I read this piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he said today the state or the power wants nonviolence as compliance, right? So that moment was very important moment for me, right? Because I learned that violence is accepted because it's a hegemonic idea. Violence is accepted to some extent. And then if it exceeds that, then it's no longer accepted. right? So nonviolence is actually a reaction to that excess of violence. Okay, so this is the first thing I came up with. And the second thing was that nonviolence will put it has the potential. It doesn't always do that. In fact, it rarely does that, but has the potential to put violence out of operation. And that's the lesson I learned from India and the whole Gandhian struggle, right? But the case with India, and I spent a year reading Gandhi, right, at that time. But India had something that most nonviolent movements don't have. At the time of Indian liberation or Indian independence, India had a population of 300 million. So yes, people can go out, as ahisma and sacrifice themselves for the cause, right? You cannot do that in the Turkmen region because the population is small, right? So India succeeded. The example of Gandhi succeeded in neutralizing violence because it can forever provide resources for nonviolent resistance. And of course, it's World War II. The British Empire is exhausted. I see all that. The Japanese are coming from the east, and the British don't have the resources to fight against Japanese who are coming through China and so on and so forth. So those are the context, right? So I came up with this idea, and then I read a lot of nonviolent literature, and some of these literature are actually pretty violent in a sense. Okay, so I discarded this idea of nonviolence and violence being opposites. Like nonviolence is good, violence is bad. And in my mind, that Iranian experience is great because, yeah, you want to achieve, you want to overcome oppression. The way is nonviolent movement, but at some point, violence is necessary. Okay. Um, and in that idea of necessary violence, I was inspired by Franz Fanon, of course, right? That in many colonial contexts, uh, nonviolence is basically co-optation. You allow yourselves to be co-opted. Okay, so to answer your question, so the question is this: why is it that nonviolence is always upon us and not the state? The state is violent. We all know that, even if they pretend that they are great and nonviolent and peaceful and human rights observing states and so on and so forth. No, they have all the means of violence, and they are not relinquishing those means of violence. If the state is nonviolent, shut down your prisons. Show me some of it. Show me some action, right? uh, Bring police down to civic administration, to civic governance. Let people control the police, not administrators, not the local government, not the state or province or city. You know, no, the states don't do that. They keep all means of violence to themselves. At the same time, because we do not accept, I do not accept uh, state as a legitimate form of governance of people's of human affairs, uh, then I have to come up with the idea that will differ from will be different from state. Okay, so this is where I come up with the idea of nonviolence. But this nonviolence is not naive nonviolence, right? Like I said in the Iranian example, yes, you don't have to engage in violence, but at some point, liberatory violence will function, will bring about the results. Now, this may be a little too uh, theoretical because in practice something else happened. If you look at Rojava, Rojava has been, and unfortunately it's declining now because of all the forces and we can't go through that in this interview, but it's Rojava has been on my mind, and I've been reading about it. Teach Rojava, uh, since it came out, it came along. But in Rojava, there is a theory of the rose. That their theory of armed resistance is called the theory of the rose. And the theory of the rose says that the Kurds are a beautiful people, like the rose. But just like the rose, they have thorns. And if somebody tries to pick this rose, they'll be punctured by the thorns. So that's for me, that's a non-violent theory of armed resistance. Is it paradoxical? Yes. But is it practical? Also, yes. Right? In other words, we as activists should try to imagine the way the world can be rebuilt through nonviolent means. And by violence here, I don't necessarily mean like killing and murdering and so on. I also mean forcing people, right? I also mean uh, I also mean not allowing people to reach their potential. That's also violent. If I'm, like I said, in my childhood experience, I see my classmate right next to me. He will never have a decent life. That's violence, right? And that's not a violence of person against person. That's a structural violence that doesn't allow this person to become to realize his full potentials, right? So what I'm looking at nonviolence here is that will this nonviolence really lead us to a new logic of living together? And for me, that's why nonviolence is important. But like I said, I'm not naive about it. And I don't, give it, kind of wholesale approval. No, sometimes you do need to defend yourself, because the forces outside of you are here to destroy you, not to make your life better or, help you or what. No, they're here, like we are seeing in Rojava right now. They are there to destroy the entire experience, right? For people who live for about 14 years in freedom, self-ruled, self-governed, and powers that we don't like it, so they come in to destroy. Anyway.
I really appreciate you breaking that down, because so many things come to mind. Like I think about a few years ago, I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there were like really horrific race riots, and I got to tour one of the churches that structurally hadn't been completely destroyed. And there was a preacher there that said, for the transatlantic slave, the ultimate emancipation was death. And so I guess I think about like nonviolence versus violence, like the act of ending one's own life in the face of unimaginable subjugation that's ahead. Like, is that violence, or is it actually sort of like a non-violent action because you can maybe have a sensibility about what's ahead? And then I also think about how I think of like Dr. King and the civil rights movement, and how in some ways I view some of those perspectives on nonviolence as being about holding on to one's humanity in the face of what the state or supremacy can do to you, versus like things leading into the Black Power era and other configurations where violence was a point of like political catharsis, or like liberatory violence as well. But yeah, I also really love like you positing like nonviolence as, yeah, like something that we need to embody in these revolutionary processes in all forms of life and relationships and governance or whatever else it may be. But
I think it's extremely interesting how different authorities have used either violence or nonviolence as a sort of purifying practice or entity that I think is what creates some of that binary of where like we get like the thoughts of it's either violent or nonviolent. Is it MLK or is it Malcolm X? Is it what are we for or against? And I think when you create such a nuanced description, I feel like that's when I'm starting to see like someone trying to hold on to something that they have more than being about an emancipatory struggle.
Yes,
Yeah.
and something like I think we started our conversation with with a reference to hegemony. One thing that I also discussed in my book was 3 levels of violence. One is structural violence, such as patriarchy. It's age-old. Nobody knows where it came from. Well, we know where it came from, but it really doesn't matter. It's just all over the place. So we have to somehow structurally dismantle this. But we can only dismantle this through everyday practice. There's no big structure where I have the key and open it and then destroy it or put it out the wall. No, it's daily practice. Then we have institutional violence, which is the source of all violence, well, most of violence today. And institutional violence is, yes, there is a state violence in terms of armies and police and imperialism and all that, right? But there is also the institutional violence of administration. For example, in Canada where I live, if you're unemployed and you have not been employed for a while, so you cannot receive like unemployment insurance or whatever, then they put you on social assistance, and what social assistance pays basically pays for your food for a week, not even your rent. So imagine a person who, for whatever reason, cannot work, and a lot of these cases are persons with, psychological traumas, addiction, some disabilities, and so on and so forth, right? That violence we do not see. We are basically condemning this person to absolute poverty for the rest of their lives. We never provide them with a springboard where they can change the path of their life. That violence is probably the most hegemonic form of violence because most people don't even see it. Yeah, they see the police as a form of, if the police raids them, they see it as a form of violence. But a lot of institutional institutional violence we do not see. The violence in administration, the violence in the way, in the order in which your affairs have to be managed by the government. These are all potentially violent means. Okay, and then the third category of violence is what I call hubristic, which means person to person. A person allows themselves to abuse and rape and beat and whatever do whatever they wish to the other person. And all these 3, by the way, in my categorization, all these 3 create one body, but we can analytically separate them because structural violence needs everyday action. Institutional violence, it needs everyday action, but it's really a matter of policy and government and so on, and so it really needs political force, right? And then hubristic or person-to-person violence is another category because it needs everyday action, it needs education, it needs cultural uplifting, it needs dealing with mental illness and so on and so forth. All of these factors come in. So each one of these actually requires somewhat overlapping but also a different solution.
The 1979 revolution is commonly framed as like very anti-American in their anti-imperialism, but so were the Shuras. They were also crushed by a national force claiming to be anti-imperialists. So I'm kind of curious what some of your read on that is and how that's led to or built some of what we see today with Western campist folks like rioting the state of Iran hard, and what you see or I see for like different models and through these council movements of like not even just like a free Iran, because like you were saying, all these borders are kind of made up, but like what a free West Asia kind of looks like, or Swana, or what the region seems like, and where some of that legacy is of like this anti-Americanism, this anti-imperialism, and this council movement.
Awesome. Thank you. So naturally, for a revolution that wanted to topple one of the strongholds of United States in the region, being monarchical Iran, Iran under monarchy, this revolution had to have the imprint of anti-imperialism. There's no doubt about it, right? I always regard the Iranian Revolution of 1979 as the last classical revolution. You do not really get any other revolution that comes just like the French Revolution comes with popular uprising and then topples the regime. Ever since the Iranian Revolution, all other revolutions like the Arab revolutions, the Arab Spring, the revolution in Lebanon 2005, Arab Spring 2010, and so on, they were not really meant to overthrow the government, the state. They meant to change the government and the pace at which the government is governing the people. So the logic has changed. So that said, yes, so the imprint of revolution is anti-imperialism, and it's an idea that permeates left, right, nationalism, clerics, atheists, whoever. Everybody understand that this was a revolution against a crony of United States imperialism in the region. So that, but then this idea boils down, in the case of the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian state, into some kind of a banal, cheap anti-Americanism. Why did the state go down that way? Because they needed to mobilize people. Ayatollah Khomeini called the United States embassy takeover in 1980, I think, or 81. He called it the second revolution because it unified the ruling class. The Islamists were not unified. So the embassy takeover unified the ruling class. But that's another story. People have written about it and so on and so forth. When the idea of anti-imperialism becomes a marker of who your friends are and who your enemies are, it becomes something banal. And that's why, in my opinion, the Western left has never understood what's going on in Iran. So because they are anti-imperialists and they hate Trump and Trump's deployment of huge armada to the region and so on and so forth, they somehow identify with the Iranian state. Not saying what an abusive, violent, and ultra neoliberal capitalist this state is. So this state is against everything that the left must hold, sacred, if you like. But they don't understand it that way. They understand this state as a cornered regional power that needs to survive, in the face of American imperialism, and therefore we should defend it. And of course, American imperialism and Israeli encroachments and plans for the region. So now my point being, if we redirect our political understanding towards the way people are being treated, then we will have a new form of understanding the region, any region, basically. Some people say, that our vision must be driven by human rights. That's correct. I do not challenge that. But I also see that human rights is being deployed as a means of imperialist powers to, demonize their enemies and so on and so forth. So I'm a little cautious using, throwing around these terms. Okay, but what is this? Has this state improved on the status of people? That's my measure. Again, I'm always driven by the way, people can, take their matters in their own hands. Potentially, sometimes they're not. That's not possible. Now, with respect to the question of what, a Western Asian society will look like, well, between the, ambitions of the Turkish state for regional control, the ambitions of the Saudis to have control over the Gulf region and keep it peaceful so that the oil can flow and so on, reach the markets. The Israeli plan for the greater Israel, which includes Lebanon, Syria, parts of Iraq, north of Saudi, like apparently it's in their scripture. Given all this, the people of the region have been courageous enough to create alternatives. Rojava is a great example of that. Another example of that is the kind of semi-self-governing towns and villages in Turkey, in the Kurdish area in Turkey. They like the Turkmen movement, they do not need to challenge the state because the state will descend upon them with great force and destroy them. But they govern themselves. I know, but I don't write about this because it will cause them security problems, if you like. I know of experiences in Iran where people in a village being tired of all these state policies and so on and so forth. They take matters in their own hand. They create village councils, and these are not ideological movements. They don't have a flag. They don't have a declaration. They don't even have a WhatsApp or Instagram account. They just do it completely silently, right? The only Instagram account is that if they decide that they need to generate income for the village through handicrafts or sort of Iranian version of Airbnb, they just advertise it online so that they bring in some income to their village. I've seen people creating councils, educating themselves, generating money, buying land, right? Taking care of their environment, create ecologically sound agriculture in that very small village of, 200 people. To protect the environment, create, a lot of beehives in the region because they need to cultivate, local, fauna and flora and so on and so forth. And basically what they are doing is, I'm creating an autonomous movement. And that's it. I don't need a flag. I don't need anything. I don't even need a state. Yes, I pay my taxes. And if there's a robbery in the road, I'll call, the local police. But that's basically the extent of my contact with the state. I've seen at least a dozen of these experiments, being unfolded in Iran right now. I'm sure all over the region, people are basically sick and tired of listening to the promises of the state and basically taking the matters in their own hands. Which, by the way, brings us to the question of land. Land is very important. Okay, it's much harder to do this in an urban environment, whereas you can do this actually in communities. Like you said, the Black agrarian sort of communities and so on and so forth. There is, by the way, the kind of autonomous urban experience like Freetown Christiana in Denmark. But that's a very special case, and it kind of the idea of autonomy is not really there in the way we want to explore it. But yes, it's an anarchist community, and it has maintained itself for decades, so it deserves applause. But my point being, this whole idea of autonomy can take many shapes, many different ways of implementing it. But I think I'm sort of convinced that one of the key elements here is land.
Yeah, I feel like that's very important. I really appreciate this book, like you were saying, of putting it in the context of these land-based struggles, and how like the Zapatistas and indigenous societies are kind of framing it in that way through our land relations. And even they're not asking every settler to go leave immediately, because I think we have a word for that, and how you would implement that. And that's not exactly what folks are putting up to policy for land back. But it is an important frame, I think, for having a different way to think through this. I just had one more question about how folks, like, the movement was defeated militarily and largely erased from official records and histories. And I'm curious where, like you were saying, like the legacy lives on, whether like in the memories of elders or in the cultural practices of Turkmen or aspirations of other oppressed groups like the Balaks, Kurds, or Arabs.
Yeah. So, Turkmens being a very small minority within the context of Persian-centric, Shi'i-centric state in Iran. So in the immediate aftermath in the 1980s, it was completely erased from memory. Part of it is because of the massacres of Iranian dissidents, mostly from the left, but also from liberals and Muslims who were against the Islamic Republic. They were killed by thousands. In the 1968 massacre in Iranian prisons in July and August of 1988. 1988, yes, that's the right date. At least 4,400 political prisoners were killed within 2 months inside the prisons. So with that kind of sort of generational erasure of activists, we could call it genocide really, because it cleared up an entire generation of activists. With that massacre in mind, so the movement was totally forgotten, right? Everybody who survived it had to flee, or if they stayed in Iran, they had to, keep quiet and so on. Those who fled to other countries, they gradually by 1990s started writing about it. But they wrote basically in terms of their experience, their memories, very particular incidents they were part of. And I used a lot of those. So that, all credit to them. But nobody ever really analytically studied this until my study, some 40 odd years later. I can see, and some activists also try to keep the legacy going in exile, to varying degrees, with very limited readership, if you like. Has the movement left a legacy that's measurable nowadays? I don't see it. However, I have seen younger generation becoming interested in the movement and kind of trying to remember. A lot of these people are actually Turkmen, so they are actually trying to learn about the generation of their parents, so to speak. How they perceived of the Turkmen culture and so on and so forth, right? Note that after the defeat of the movement, land was privatized again through some remarkably cunning ways of the state. So they took the lands from the peasants, gave it to the economic foundations of the state, who was supposed to equitably distribute land among the peasants, but then they sold the lands to the cronies of the state. So the land was privatized again. The legacy is gone. But I'm hoping that this legacy will live on if there is awareness of this legacy, that things can be done different nowadays. However, that said, at this particular moment when we are doing this conversation, that America has moved its huge armada to the region. The Islamic Republic is conducting military maneuvers and exercises in the Gulf region and so on and so forth. So at this point, everything is really up in the air. We don't know where the whole country is going. We don't even know if there is a country that a year down the road. So it's the situation is very volatile. Which brings me to the point that if there is any future actually in there for the people, not for necessarily for the policies of the state or the Iran or states of the region. If there is any future, is that we can create autonomous movements, and no matter where the country goes, people will live on, and their collective will can create something new, something better. Right? I have always said that a better Iran is always possible, right? But it's possible if we learn from the experiences of the past and the past generations and their creative moments and how they reimagine their own being, their own country, and so on. So I'm hoping that this will happen, not just in Iran, but in every place in this world where the majority of people are oppressed. In Latin America, in Africa, one of the richest continents in the world, Africa, being exploited so drastically, right? And leaving nothing for the people, right? Asia, right? So I'm hoping that these experiences will help us, and communication about these experiences, learning from one another, and reading the experiences of one another, listening, viewing nowadays, about the experiences of one another, will probably, give us some hope that a better future is possible for the entire humanity.
Yeah, I feel like I remember you said there being in the book there was like some communications and connections between like the Turkmen Council movement and like the Kurdish freedom movement at the time. Do you see like that still being something that's alive, or like after the 80s it kind of, or things went silent, or what was the vibe?
It's interesting, but that's a great question. It's interesting. The courts have been having their own political vision since the 1940s. So their vision goes a long way, and it has become part of their culture, right? But that's different from the Turkmen experience, where these ideas basically, emerged in the in early 1980s, in 1979, right? There is, fortunately, but that's my answer. There is, fortunately, a lot of, thanks to modern technology, a lot of communication between all different groups of people, right? City residents, in Tehran, talking about their experience with the Kurds, publishing a lot of their experiences in Persian language, and then, the Baluchi minority, right? Having their own vision articulated, in Instagram and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of communication nowadays in Iran, about the future of Iran. Unfortunately, this, impending, uh, you know, monster of war is basically is blocking our way into the future at this moment. But what I'm really thankful, to be able to see at this, in my age now, is that we are no longer these separate islands where, each one of us wants to do our own thing, and wants to have our own vision implemented and so on. We actually can learn from each other, and that sort of accelerated communication and accelerated reading also gives me hope. That accelerated uh, 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 exchange of experiences gives me a lot of hope. Note that 3 years ago, 2022, with the Woman Life Freedom Movement, that was a movement whose vision came from Kurdistan, and not just Iranian Kurdistan; it came from Rojava, right? So these ideas are so so well communicated, and that they can actually, with the experience, they can simply sit in and become part of us, no matter where we are, right? So if you remember the woman life freedom movement, which was, people call it the world's first feminist movement, driven by women, led by women. Okay, but it was a movement that wanted to change the Iranian culture. So it wanted to change structural violence that I'm talking about, and it wanted to change the structural violence, not only at the institutional level, and that led to the practical unveiling of women and the state refraining from imposition of veil onto women. That's as a result of which women are basically free to unveil or veil or whatever in the streets nowadays. But also wanted to change the entire culture, in the sense that that it from that moment onwards, it's very hard to talk about, at least in public, about discriminatory laws about, or defend the discriminatory laws against women. So that kind of practical equality or notion of equality, societies change this way. It's a molecular change, if you like, but that molecular change at some point just erupts, and it becomes a common idiom of the age. So, we'll see what happens in the next few weeks to the country, to the region. What I'm trying to say here is that we can communicate, we can learn from each other, we translate each other's works. Persians are great in translating the works of other experiences. So it just, translation in Iran is a big thing, and a good translator is always being admired. In the sense that we read about the challenges in Latin America, we read about Argentina, we read about United States and Canada, read about Africa, and the plights of the miners in the Congo, and so on and so forth. So Persians are being exposed to all these global experience. Okay, for me, the hope is the new digital communications will actually help us learn from each other, and take ideas and implement it in their own context. So we have the means. Basically, now we have to have the will, and I don't see any shortage of the will. I see the will all over the place, and that's my hope.
Thank you so much. Are there any last thoughts that you wanted to put out? We really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to this show. I enjoyed our conversation. I think I'm hoping that the future of humanity, despite this very dark and bleak times that we are having right now, will be a better future, and it will involve people, not statesmen, not big corporation, capitalists, not anyone who wishes to impose themselves, but perhaps at some point they can learn, that people can govern themselves, and they can create, maybe not a fancy society, if you like, but a just society, where everyone, is treated with respect and with dignity. I think I'm hoping, towards that, and that's your generation's task.
It's all of our job, You can't skirt off the generational accountability now. You got all that knowledge still. We still need you. I hate hearing that. I can't stand hearing it. Like, it's still all of our task. You're going to be in the council with me too.
Maybe in the Council of Elders, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's got to be some coordination going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hey listeners, this is Prince here, and I'm here to give you a reminder that if you want to support The Dugout and our anarchist musings about the world, politics, and culture, you can find us in a couple of ways. Our anarchist podcast is shaking things up, and we want you to be a part of the action, so here's how you can support. When you support us on Patreon, you get early access to episodes and special live streams. So to do that, head to patreon.com/The Dugout Pod. Throw in your support and let's keep the vibes going. And then if you want to follow us on social media, on Instagram or TikTok, find us at The Dugout Pod to hear our behind the scenes musings. Sometimes we share some weird reading. Sometimes we're smoking it down and you can join us. But in general, sharing is caring. So let people you know about the Dugout Podcast. If there's particular episodes that you think someone might get some kind of wisdom or knowledge from, send it to them and find us online and stay tuned for another episode.